my name is Udbela, and I've just started my PhD at ITU this February. So super early stage. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you. So thank you very much for having me. My presentation today is about alternative approaches to perceiving and understanding non-human others in video games. In particular, how non-human figures and the way we engage with them can destabilize inherited classifications through which we typically assign moral or epistemic status. And I'll get there partly by way of Jonathan Birch's Precautionary ethics, which helps me articulate or inspires the epistemic condition that I'm most interested in, followed by analysis of two games or presentations of two games as exemplary case studies. Right. And so firstly, I want to just gesture at the landscape. More and more, there are digital games that are presenting highly diverse explorations of ecological thinking, taking ecological relations and nature more seriously rather just than presenting nature as a backdrop, as resource, threat, or kind of like an aesthetic exploration. But as something with the potential to generate new ways of being and knowing when it comes to climate imaginaries and human-nature relations. And of course, alongside this, there's a growing and sophisticated body of existing scholarship, which has produced valuable accounts of games as these potentially transformative sites for remodeling like more dominant anthropocentric frameworks that traditionally shape environmental discourse and imaginaries in games. As you can see here, and I won't talk too much about it, but including this community here today, so a lot of inspiring people, and so my presentation builds on this existing work, but wants to look at a specific question on how games may train or change the ways that players can foster particular habits of attending to non-human others. And so the grounding I'm working from draws on Felix Guattari's ecosophy and the idea that if climate change is a crisis of imagination as much as a scientific problem, then we need to interrogate those cultural forms through which we practice underlying perceptual and ethical habits. And so my argument following Heise and also Miguel Sicard is that games are not just mirroring existing attitudes, but they can be sites of critical unlearning where human-nature relations can genuinely be reimagined. But many games, many of those concerned with non-human characters kind of miss the mark. Animals are frequently embedded in game landscapes as harvestable matter, companions, or anthropomorphized characters. For example, in Red Dead Redemption 2, which does kind of portray hunting as morally permissible. It reflects like a real life practice, but it ultimately rests on the broader social cultural marginalization of animals. And also in Winter Burrow, where you play a mouse, kind of gathering resources to refurbish your house, it still largely reproduces familiar anthropocentric perspectives, as in Stardew Valley. And even animal mayhem games, which do something more subversive by kind of challenging or subverting the expectations you have of how an animal should be or how it should behave. It tends to diffuse the strangeness through comedy rather than sustain it throughout. And so, of course, as a medium, video games has the potential to explore radical otherness in meaningful ways and genuinely challenge anthropocentric ontologies. So what kind of games do this and how? Before I get into the two case studies, I want to talk a bit about how radical otherness and radical uncertainty is explored in Jonathan Birch's book, The Edge of Sentience. And this is a philosophical and policy-oriented book where he develops a precautionary ethics for beings whose sentience is genuinely uncertain, and he defines it for the purposes of his framework, sentience, as the capacity for valence experiences, whether something can feel good or bad or pleasure or pain. And his first few chapters kind of surveys the long-standing philosophical and scientific disagreement around sentience and why sentience assessment is so difficult. And so if you can't make, how are you supposed to make decisions about beings that you can't really place or assess? And he argues that we should look at these beings as sentience candidates, so beings for whom evidence of sentience is uncertain but non-negligible, and for whom that uncertainty warrants a precautionary and proportionate response. And he extends this framework to invertebrates, fetuses, AI systems, basically all beings that resist classification under existing categories of moral consideration. And he also highlights the importance of kind of inclusive and democratic processes where it's not only about experts kind of determining sentience candidates, but ordinary citizens should rise to the occasion to help determine ethical responses. And his last few chapters focus on AI systems, and he argues against complacency towards systems whose trajectories you can't fully yet anticipate. And he argues that regulatory frameworks have to run ahead of these, run ahead of current knowledge. And I think this is this is also a question for cultural forms such as games where you practice underlying perceptual and ethical habits, in how you imagine, in how you relate to more than human or non-human others in uncertain ecological and technological futures. So this is a principle that it's also kind of broadly applicable. And so Wallace's book is very policy focused, and he rather asks how should we act towards or make decisions on non-human others at the edge of sentience. I think it's also, you can identify a broader question there, which is how should we act towards non-human others that you are uncertain about or do not fully understand. Because what really interests me is his epistemic posture, or the epistemic condition he describes, namely attending to beings that resist classification without trying to resolve that uncertainty. And I think his framework crucially depends on not just the right principles that he does outline, but the right habits of perception. So being attuned to subtleties when developing new ways of interacting with beings that you can't fully know. And that's something games can do and do model. And it's also a framing that I think is particularly relevant for this kind of research, as it foregrounds the need to develop frameworks capable of engaging with radically different entities that can't or shouldn't be assimilated into inherited anthropocentric categories. And so I want to illustrate this with two examples before continuing to the case study. So if you take zombies and kind of these more classic games, existing research has understood these as post-human others. They don't have valence experiences. By design, they have a pre-categorized moral status where you kind of know what is morally permissible to do. And this can also be seen with robots, for example, especially in some more philosophically ambitious games, which have kind of staged encounters that appear to destabilize these categories in which moral status is kind of pre-assigned. For example, in Nier Automata, which presents machines as kind of these hostile antagonists before showing you that actually they have capacity for humanity or for grief, or they have villages, and also with the whole conflict between androids and machines, where you kind of also find out that they kind of share this capacity for humanity. Also, for example, in Bioshock, the Little Sisters dilemma, where these are like genetically altered little girls who are conditioned to harvest resources from corpses. But then you have to decide if you kill them, if you harvest them, or if you spare them. And so both of these are kind of very philosophically compelling moments. But I think these games also still depend on a prior ontological clarity. So a settled sense of what kinds of things exist and how do they differ, because the human remains the stable center of value here, also the stable center of address for these dilemmas, because you're being asked to kind of reflect or ponder about is this being human enough? How large an extent do they differ from this? And so these kinds of status quo classifications still remain. So my question or argument is then that games that deal with non-human others, if they sustain rather than resolve this uncertainty in classifications, then they might have the potential to more substantively subvert anthropocentric epistemologies. And so I think two games exemplify this kind of well, Fae and In Other Waters. Fae is a platformer adventure game where you play kind of a fox-like creature navigating a forest. And the central mechanic here is sound, because you have to sing to communicate with other plants and animals, and this is how you kind of unlock the world. And the gameplay is left intentionally ambiguous. There's minimal guiding, very minimal guiding, and no dialogue. And threaded through this kind of exploratory journey is this conflict with the Silent Ones, which are these mechanical, corrupted adult versions of the Fae, who are kind of capturing other forest creatures. And so this kind of non-verbal and sound-based communication aspects resist anthropomorphic understanding by creating a very foreign and exploratory setting. it withholds the interiority of the animals, as you can listen to the communication between the organisms of this ecosystem, but you can't understand the experience at all, especially as the game is also especially vague. And the creatures are clearly being something, but what that is structurally inaccessible. And I think this was just like a fun comment that I found of a player talking about their experience, and I'm not like analyzing this or anything, but I do think this kind of gestures towards this register of experience that stays out of your reach. And so I think Faye models the epistemic condition that Birch kind of describes, which is genuine, sustained uncertainty about what these beings are internally, but also combined with the like care and relational attention that doesn't depend on having to know or having to resolve this uncertainty. And I think this distinct form of ecological awareness can focus on perception and interpretation is also found in other waters. And in this game, you play an AI system in the diving suit of a xenobiologist exploring an alien ocean, and you're trying to find a missing researcher. And what's distinctive about this game is its register, because the world is represented not iconically but symbolically, and it presents the alien ocean through a very abstracted interface. It only appears to you, via maps, sonar traces, text-based data, and it kind of stands in contrast to other ocean exploration games where there's more of a scenic and anthropocentric gaze, where it's highly visual and panoramic. And this abstraction is not only aesthetic, but it's also epistemic, because knowledge of the world emerges through this kind of incomplete and mediated signals that you get through your measuring instruments. And so you're not positioned as someone who can master the environment through knowing, as with like the coloniality of knowledge. But even though you're kind of gaining these partial information, there's still an explicit limitation to that, to what you can understand about this alien ecosystem. And this is also heightened with the narrative itself, as you're piecing together a mystery, not only tracking where the researcher went, but also learning about the inhabitants of this world. And so near the end of the game, when you arrive at an area called the Bloom, which is an area kind of overgrown with algae and decay, and you understand, or you find out what the planet's history was, and you also find out like what happened to the missing researcher. But essentially, a corporation was running genetic experiments on native organisms, and they caused near ecological collapse. And this is the first time that the game also deviates from the yellow and blue like color palette. Suddenly, it's like greens and reds, so something's wrong. But yeah, so this narrative part also further supports like this reading, because the corporation kind of failing to control the environment or to control these organisms is also a reflection of how you treat the unknowability of an ecosystem. If you try to bring it under full comprehension or full control, you're trying to either solve that problem or like bring it under control, rather than respecting that as a condition. And so therefore, the game's overall sustained like withholding of full ecological knowledge is part of a greater argument grounded in entanglement, narratively and aesthetically, about how you should approach ecological knowledge altogether. And so the epistemic condition found here then reflects Birch's condition as well, where uncertainty is paired with attentiveness and partial understanding as the player's primary mode of engagement with an environment that you can't fully grasp as a human. But of course, as Stefano Gueleni argues, following Nagel's examinations or ponderings of whether human imagination can fully imagine another being's perspective or experiences, of course, representations of non-human experience in general or in games will obviously remain within a human phenomenology. But of course, Gueleni also notes that games can disclose experiences previously inaccessible to humans and produce a shift in how you can relate to the world. Seen in the experimental bat game he's talking about there, where you can feel like potentially what it might be to have the perspective of a bat. But I think rather than asking how games can grant access to animal interiority better, we might ask how games can restructure the epistemic condition from which players approach non-human others altogether. So if inaccessibility is an ontological condition rather than a limitation to overcome, then making the inaccessibility more sustained, I think, is a meaningful intervention. And I think that's what Faye and In Other Waters do. Yeah, so Faye does this through silence and sound-based interaction as a way of not understanding the ecosystem. In Other Waters does this through aesthetic abstraction and kind of inference, like gaining knowledge through inference and keeping the player at an interpretive distance. And both games emerge as unconventional games that prompt reflective gameplay and produce this kind of sustained epistemic uncertainty or unknowing. And so structurally limiting dominant epistemologies and opening space for kind of alternative ones could then generate more genuine engagements with non-human otherness. And also, like, just more of a curiosity, I suppose, like ocean games, I think, are also a very rich site for this kind of structured unknowing that I've been describing. The ocean is already kind of an area of great epistemic humility. It's really vast, it's opaque, it's poorly understood, like in our world, and game representations still often default to kind of presenting ocean engagement as like either exploring it, it's kind of like a spectacle, or having kind of more horror atmospheres, kind of exploring the abyss, or having more, or perpetuating more of these extractive logics that you see generally. So I think this is also a very interesting direction for this kind of research. And then I actually removed a slide because I thought I wouldn't have enough time, but I do. But another like future research direction I think is plant life, which is also really interesting. And I was going to talk about the game The Pale Beyond, which is really good. But at the end of it, you also kind of encounter this dilemma, a moral dilemma, but in regards to a sentient, or is it sentient, like sentient tree. And there's obviously the tree doesn't talk. There's nothing there. It's a tree. But it also, if you eat fruits from the tree, grants you the meta ability to then travel between timelines, i.e. your playthroughs. So I think maybe now there might not be as many case studies on like plant life and sentience and that, and how you can relate to otherness in that kind of sphere. But I think that is also I think that's a cool example of what's to come and what's another direction this could take of radical otherness. And yeah, so in conclusion, structured unknowing tries to name an alternative epistemic condition and attitude towards non-humanness that games can model. So Faye and In Other Waters kind of are two examples of how, two games that contain the same epistemic condition, even though they use different formal approaches to kind of get to that. And I think this is kind of the epistemic virtue that we can extract from Birch's thinking, that the right response to beings that resist classification isn't about trying to resolve this, but about the attentiveness to that. And this will matter for how we imagine non-human others in games, and how we can challenge anthropocentric limitations in the way we imagine and shape the future. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.